haven't seen the live thing.
There it is.
Okay, here we go. Good morning. Today is Wednesday, January 24th. It's 9 a.m. and this is a special joint meeting of the Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs Committee and the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We're here to talk this morning about housing and regulatory reform. We're coming up, I think it's April 4th is the 54th anniversary of Act 250 passing. So it has for us stood the state in good stead for helping do a lot of the planning and development that we often all refer to as smart growth. We also know that a law that's 54 years old in a state that's changed a great deal in 4 years in between, especially at the regional and municipal planning level, it's always worth reviewing and seeing if we can make improvements. So with that, do you want to help kick us off? We have, just another quick logistical note. So we have a lot of witnesses today. Chair Hinsdale and I talked about it a little bit. We're not going to do questions until, if we have time at the end, we'll get to a Q&A time. Other than.
No, I don't think so. They like diverting attention.
Yes.
We have 16 witnesses, so we're going to be marching right along. People have roughly 10 minutes, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot from all those folks. Anything else you'd like to add this morning?
Well, a couple things. I think that also means we'll try to have a very short bio break somewhere in here. And your chair, a man after my own heart, has written it in. But if you need to use the restroom or get up and do something, please feel free to do that. So I am Chair Keisha Ram Hinsdale from Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. And I don't know the last time these two committees had a joint hearing, but I think it's incredibly fitting, not just in exploring the dual housing and climate crises we face generally, but in the aftermath of a flood that has left many people without adequate housing or living in unsafe conditions. I was just looking at some data from the World Economic Forum about the lung, respiratory, and other illnesses that are tracked post-flood in a lot of areas that see frequent flooding, and the toll on people's well-being and the economy are both tremendous when we think about climate vulnerability. We know in Vermont that our climate vulnerability really lands most squarely on rural seniors who are trying to find somewhere to live, allows them to access healthcare and quality of life easily, and gets them out of very large single-family homes that could be turned over for larger families that want to grow and expand. So I just think it's really fitting, not only in the aftermath of the flood, but because when economy and environment are pitted against each other, Vermonters lose, people lose. So it is really incumbent upon us to be working together to figure out how we meet the moment of the climate reality that we're in and how we advance housing access for everyone that is safe, warm, and close to places that they live, work, and play. So with that, I think one more logistical note is just so people watching know, we each picked 8 witnesses from our committees, and we'll take turns introducing folks, unless you want to do it, which is also fine.
Yeah, I thought we might get a call on people, so we
Okay.
keep going.
Just make a
Right.
general request, which is,
Yeah.
could you use your diaphragms to project here? Because it's a long way from our witnesses to people hearing all the way in the back. So, and there's no microphone. So I would encourage us all to use our big indoor voices.
Follow Senator Clarkson's lead.
Yeah.
Thank
What's the goal of this meeting?
Well, I'll speak for Senator Hinsdale, and I talked about it. I'll jump right to sort of the bottom line in a little bit. We often have the committees take a different view of growth and development, regulation, impact on the environment. And rather than last year, we went through, I think, a difficult process whereby the Economic Development Committee brought forward a bill that then we responded to. So rather than have us going in sequence, we thought it would be more productive for all of us to have the conversation in parallel, even if it's the bills might sequence in that way, like similar to last year. But if we have the conversation in parallel all the way along, we can stay better apprised of how each committee is looking at the same overarching issue.
I've asked Magali to share a visual because I think it speaks more highly than I can about why we're here. At some point, our job is to develop housing and commercial activity that keeps our state vital. And, Act 250, as I understand it, was originally intended to focus on land use. And where we know the land use is residential, commercial, industrial, we need to be able to build densely to really fulfill the ultimate principle of Act 250, which is compact village settlement with working lands around it. And so with our shared jurisdictions, I think we need to look at the flow chart of permits and all of the places that you could get sent back to go or, get appealed into perpetuity, or have one person in charge of decision-making that can stop dense, affordable housing and appropriate commercial activity from happening where we've already designated the land use for such activity. So, I think the other reality that I like to highlight about Act 250 is we talked about it as something once upon a time where you could have this conversation on your front porch so that you encouraged smart development, not so that you went all the way to the Supreme Court to stop development. And so Act 250, I think, has become the symbol for what has strayed from its original intention to create density where it belongs.
So,
Or creep development, I think.
so this meeting is about Act 250. It's not about what's standing in the way of housing for Vermonters.
I would say any obstacle, what's game for, I'm hoping that our witnesses will help us understand. Act 250 is maybe the largest, most visible object for discussion, but it's certainly not the only thing. So I'm hoping that we'll have any of our witnesses who see other aspects of developing housing, anything impacting them, that we'll hear about them and get them all on the table.
And I would also say we have put into play with our legislation of the last couple of years, a number of legs to the stool that we're hoping will support updating and reforming all the barriers that we face with housing and protecting our environment. And one leg of that stool are Charlie and Catherine, the planners. So we have this exciting mapping and planning update. We have the designations and we have the Act 250 reforms. Act 250 isn't the only issue with housing and the environment. We have many other issues, and where it needs to be, we need to greenlight it is what I think Charlie and Catherine are going to be addressing, and what we. So I think it's the bringing all those pieces together, which will give us a cleaner, easier, simpler way to understand, to greenlight what we save.
Essentially,
We
we've
protect.
asked experts to tell us what's getting in the way of housing, and we're here to listen to
Yeah.
them. And one expert that I had called on, they're coming to our committee, and I hope you'll hear them as well, is the Pew Charitable Trust. They've been following all the laws across the country that have loosened up housing and rental vacancy. And where you find a healthy rental and homeownership vacancy rate, you find low rent increases and low homelessness.
Right.
And they can spell that out across the country. So we face both our unique rural challenge in Vermont, but we also face a national housing crisis that has very clear data-informed solutions.
Right.
And we're here to talk about that.
One thing Senator Ron Hinsdale mentioned was, the notion of looking at it. Energy, the environment and economy aren't opponents, and that is an old.
Yes.
Go back through numerous gubernatorial addresses. Each governor comes along and says the same thing. They go hand in hand, and so I think we're always trying to remember that and figure it out. It's a long time ago, but Governor Davis's original formulation for who was on a district commission was someone from the business community, someone from the environmental community, and an upstanding citizen. So it was always about more different voices at the table. And with that, it's a perfect time to hear Mr. Baker's voice.
Thank you. That's, I don't know if I could follow up on all of that, but thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. For the record, my name is Charlie Baker. I'm the Executive Director of the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, this is my normal room speaking voice. But I'm here today testifying both on behalf of the Chittenden County RPC and Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies, which is the State Association of Regional Planning Commissions. Personally, I've been a professional planner in Vermont for more than 15 years and more than 35 years in total. And one thing over that long time, which I hesitate to write that down, but one thing that experience has taught me is that our land use regulations absolutely do influence developer behavior. So we can see that we had a housing construction boom in the 60s, 70s, and it lasted into the 80s, right? Because things were grandfathered. Act 250 didn't really take effect or have full effect until probably we started getting to the 90s. But we had a housing growth rate of about 2%, which is part of the reason I think we got Act 250. Like, whoa, things are moving too fast. There's too much change happening in our communities. However, we maybe turned the dial too far. And so the last couple of decades, we've been less than 0.5% growth rate. And just in the long time that I've been working in different places, a healthy growth rate is closer to around 1%. So I have that in the back of my mind as I think about this. So how do we get to kind of a healthier growth rate for housing? Well, first, I'd like to thank the committees for supporting the language in S100 to have us do these studies around Act 250, the designation program, and regional planning. And I believe there are 4 broad goals that those studies taken together will help us achieve. One is smart planned growth by encouraging more housing in the right places. And part of that is by reducing regulatory redundancy. Stronger natural resource protection. So back to this, growth and environmental conservation happen at the same time. But resource protection for flood resilience, our rural character, and achieving our carbon reduction goals. So we're achieving multiple goals here. Number 3 is reinvestment in our downtowns and village centers by making it easier to get state designations and increasing reinvestment in those cherished places. And the 4th one is a more general one about getting more consistency and certainty in the local and regional planning and state regulatory systems. So helping the system work together better, because it's been cobbled together over the last 50 years without necessarily all the updates to the system. So we have planning, we have regulation and permitting, and we have investment, right? So planning, regional planning commissions, regulation, permitting, Act 250 is a part of, but not the whole thing. And sorry, I'm looking at Sabina. And to your point, Chair Bray, I think Act 250 is often used as a euphemism for all of the permitting in the state. And so I hope people kind of keep that in mind. Oftentimes, we're not just talking about Act 250, or there may be something else indeed. But all of this, the planning, the regulations, and the permitting that goes with that, and the investments are part of how the legislature has put into place policy to help implement our municipal and regional plans, right? So you require us to do regional plans. Most of our municipalities do plans. And our regulatory system ought to be helping us achieve what those plans are calling for. So Act 250 has been a positive regulatory system for Vermont over the years and has done a lot, certainly on the environmental and rural character side. However, there are opportunities to make it better. I'm here this morning to ask you to review and support the recommendations from the Regional Planning, Act 250, and designation studies, and I'm purposefully mentioning them together as a group. We obviously, the RPCs, were responsible for the regional planning report, and we worked closely with the Act 250 and designation study efforts to have the 3 studies align and mutually support each other. And taken together, the recommendations of the 3 studies help better align our planning, regulation, and investments to better achieve our municipal, regional, and state goals. And how do they do that? And you already started to touch on this at in your introductory comments. But one of the weaknesses of Act 250 has been the lack of the map to guide permitting decisions. And the state has had conversation over the decades about a state map. But I think our recommendation is rather than doing a new state mapping process, let's build on what we already have, which is the Regional Planning Commission maps. But to do that, we need to update and provide consistent mapping so that there's a strong foundation for Act 250 reviews and designation investments. This will provide increased review in important natural resource areas and decreased review in planned growth areas that have infrastructure and good zoning. This is where our plans call for housing growth, and the municipalities determine the details of land use density and design through their zoning. They're the people dealing with the neighbors, right? Which I think is an appropriate responsibility for the municipalities. Last year, you adopted S100, which focused on municipal zoning to increase housing in areas with infrastructure. This year is a time to update Act 250 to support municipalities in achieving what was required of them last year. Municipalities in all parts of Vermont should be able to have some planned growth so that not all the growth is concentrated in and around Chittenden County. As a group, the RPCs want towns in all of our regions to be healthy and prosperous. So the state RPCs are recommending the statutory language that would make our regional plans more consistent in our future land use planning, including delineating the areas that meet designation program requirements and have the potential to meet criteria established by the NRB to achieve exemption from Act 250. The designation program is proposing to simplify the designations from 5 to 3 designations. The NRB is recommending a 3-tier system in which we are clear that we are trying to encourage growth in the first tier, our planned growth areas, and we are clear about tier 3 area, trying to preserve those natural resources and get a higher level of review at Act 250. In the regional planning report, we call that conservation, rural conservation areas. And I did put a graphic in front of all of you. You can see how these relate. And thank you to the Department of Housing and Community Development for developing this. So even though I'm acting like it's mine, I can produce it. And you can see how these relate. And really, we're not, and I'm just going to kind of address kind of the elephant in the room. I don't think this is about weakening Act 250, but rather strengthening it to better accomplish the state's goals. I'm not sure there were really, even as much review does happen there, that we're really accomplishing what we want to do in terms of rural protection through the Act 250 process right now, really due to where the jurisdictional thresholds are. There's also a report that we prepared about how we can make, how it could work for high capacity municipalities to obtain a delegation agreement from the NRB after demonstrating that their regulations are functionally equivalent to Act 250. I recommend reviewing that report for another option to consider. And finally, creating greater alignment between our plans, regulations, and incentive programs will greatly enhance our ability as a state to achieve our shared goal. We'd be happy to provide more detail about these issues in public testimony, and thank you for your consideration. And I won't ask for any questions because I know you have a lot of witnesses.
Thank you very much. And you have a great sense of timing. That was about 10 minutes on almost.
I'm shocked.
Thank you so much. So next up, please, we'd like to welcome Zeke Davison, Chief Operating Officer of Summit Properties.
Good morning. Can you all see and hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Again, Zeke Davison, Summit Properties. We're the largest private developer of mixed income and affordable housing in the state of Vermont. I appreciate being invited today. I testified to economic development last week. So I've seen a lot of you recently, but obviously met all of you as S100 was going through the legislature last year. So I'll hopefully beat 10 minutes here. I want to try to make some market related points and tie them back into some Act 250 policy related points. And if there's any group of people that I can say that sentence to without completely glossing over, it's you all. So Keisha, Senator Rom Hinsdale referenced this earlier, and hopefully you'll have the Pew Charitable Trust talk to you all. But there's a lot of research that demonstrates that homelessness and housing affordability are directly correlated to rental vacancy rate, right? Which is just a measure of empty units. And a healthy housing market, common wisdom needs a vacancy rate of around 5%. Vermont's closer to 2%. It's been under 1% in Chittenden County for much of the last 3 years. And that vacancy rate is really driven by a supply and demand curve. When there's low supply, there's not a lot that sits empty, prices go up, homelessness goes up. And our vacancy rate is skewed because we simply don't have enough supply of housing units to create a healthy housing market right now, which has led to some of the homelessness and the housing cost burden we've seen. So that's all the precursor to why don't we have enough homes, right? There are a lot of reasons. And one of which is that for the last 50 years, we've made it hard to develop in Vermont. It's a policy decision. It was a preservation of our state at a time, like Charlie said, of uncontrolled growth. And it was a trade-off to preserve rural, agrarian, open spaces and prevent sprawl. We love this about Vermont. This is uniquely Vermont. We all cherish that brand and what Act 250 has done for Vermont. But we also find ourselves today so far behind, generationally behind on housing supply. And market conditions have shifted so quickly in the last 5 years that housing costs and homelessness have exploded, and we really don't have a path to combating that right now with subsidy, with money. Our homelessness rates are second highest in the country. We're on par with major urban states, New York, California, District of Columbia. And unfortunately, this is really also now becoming a reality that's uniquely Vermont. And at its core, this is a policy trade-off, and it's luckily one that the legislature can address. In areas where towns want growth, where they're ready for growth, where they've gone through the democratic process to codify growth and what that should look like, we have really one meaningful policy lever that isn't subsidy that can give supply a better chance, a fighting chance here, and that's reduction or elimination of Act 250 jurisdiction in those areas. So I made all these arguments in front of your two committees last year on behalf of S100. The Act 250 provisions of that bill, Charlie mentioned that became a municipal bill. There were a few Act 250 provisions, but they became really narrow, and they did meaningfully impact one project that's going through the state right now and going through permitting, and that's one of ours. It's a 200-unit mixed income master plan community in Middlebury that we're going through the permitting process on. But so I kind of use that today as a sample size of one, which is better than a sample size of nothing as we talk about this. So because of S100 and because of the work done by the town of Middlebury, we're ready to break ground this year. If that legislative change had not been made, the project would be smaller in scope, or we would have, it was altogether too risky for us to invest the pre-development costs. And also importantly for VHFA and VHCB to invest their subsidy resources in. So the trade-off of risk and margin really would not have been worth it on that project. And even if we decided to move forward on that project with Act 250 jurisdiction, we would certainly not be breaking ground this year. So one common reaction I do want to address that I get whenever we talk about Act 250 and smart growth is, wait, you can't pin all this on Act 250. It's not the only driving force here. And I've sort of struggled always with how to respond to that because it's both true, but I think at the same time, it kind of avoids some of the responsibility of Act 250. We have enough land in Vermont to house all Vermonters. We've made it too difficult, or we've chilled the use of that land altogether in the name of the character of Vermont that we're trying to preserve. And it sort of is a false choice. And it's created these market conditions that are on par with the challenges of major urban centers. But developers can't get urban center rentals or sales prices. We don't have the incomes to support that. We build less. Here we are. So the legislature this year can make a policy decision to help developers, large and small. By Vermont standards, we're a pretty large developer. But the ones that are, the developers that are toying with that, do I build 8 units? Do I build 12 units? Do I build 20 units? That you can help developers make the same decision that S100 has let us make. Proceed with a smart growth, town-supported housing project that the state desperately needs. The major changes were punted, as Charlie said, this session, and those are really being proposed now. I think the elimination of Act 250 jurisdiction in meaningfully drawn Tier 1 areas where the towns want the growth. There's been a democratic process for imagining what that growth is going to look like. It is really the least we can do on the policy side to be serious about turning the tide on housing supply here in Vermont. And I hope we can do this really soon and appreciate what you are all doing to take a serious look at this again this year. So I beat 10 minutes. Thank you all, and appreciate you guys all sitting in the room today to talk about this.
Thank you so much. With that, I'd like to go to Catherine Dimitruk, who's the chair of the Vermont Association of Planners and Development Agents. Good morning, Catherine.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me today. Again, I'm Catherine Dimitruk. I'm Director of Northwest Regional Planning Commission, and I'm Chair of the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies. It's pretty cool to be a part place in my career where I can say way back when I started. So 30 years ago, when I started, we were definitely at a place that people would reference where growth was at a scary level. In Grand Isle County, we grew 30% in a decade. That's just crazy amounts of growth when you think about what's happening now. Our schools were at capacity. People were justifiably scared about what was happening in Vermont. And Act 250 really served as an important check on that. And Act 250 has been valuable for the state of Vermont. But now we're at a place where, regional growth has been 5% over a decade, statewide 3%. We have a shortage of workers and housing. In Franklin and Grand Isle counties alone, we estimate there's 7,600 needed housing units in order to create an accessible and affordable housing market. And our communities now have robust regulations. When I started, most of our towns had no zoning, or what they did have was still copied on a mimeograph machine. Things have changed a lot, and we are ready for something new. I love Act 250. I just love it. I remember learning about it and understanding how uniquely Vermont it was, and just being so proud to be part of a state that had something like Act 250. But loving Act 250 doesn't mean that it can't change. There are some things that are wrong with Act 250 for what we need today. Act 250 regulates residential more stringently than it regulates commercial growth. It's a quite stark difference when you look at the jurisdictional triggers for Act 250 for residential versus commercial. Act 250 doesn't care. Act 250 doesn't care about climate resilience. And Act 250 doesn't care about rewarding larger scale, well-planned, comprehensive projects. And I'm going to give you some examples to illustrate the points. There are two projects in Franklin County. I won't name the towns because one of them is still going through process, but one is a 12-unit residential development on less than 2 acres of land, hundreds of feet from the state designated growth center and highly walkable area. That requires Act 250 review. Permit fees alone were $7,200. And that doesn't even count the cost of actually preparing and going through the Act 250 application. Up the road, in a not a walkable area, much farther from the designated area, a development with 7 commercial buildings, almost 200 parking spaces and 2 acres of pavement didn't require Act 250 review because it was located on less than 10 acres, just barely, but less than 10 acres. So that's a great contrast that you can see to illustrate my point about how residential is regulated much more stringently from a jurisdictional trigger perspective than commercial. And then I want to give you a couple of examples related to the Home Act that you passed last year. Assume you've got a 9-acre parcel of land that has access to water and sewer. If you want to fully build that out with commercial, you're exempt from Act 250. If you want to build from an equity perspective, if you want to build 8 mansions on that parcel with water and sewer, you can do that and not require Act 250. But if you want to take advantage of the Home Act provisions that were passed last year and build 45 market rate housing units that are available to our people who want to and currently live in Vermont, you have to go through Act 250. So Act 250 now is in contrast to the Home Act provisions that you passed last year. And another example, statewide, the local level now, duplexes must be allowed where single family used to only be allowed. So you have to allow duplexes in the same place. Act 250 still counts duplexes as 2 units. So there's a hill that needs to be climbed in the Act 250 area to bring it into parity with the Home Act. Fortunately, as Charlie mentioned, there's some solutions that you asked us to work on last year as part of the Home Act. And we have given you some recommendations from the planning perspective, the incentive perspective, and the regulatory perspective. And taken together, those recommendations can really address those issues of equity and jurisdiction. And I want to make it clear that nothing in these studies are recommending weakening 250. Nothing is recommending weakening the standards, weakening the environmental provisions. The recommendations are to change the jurisdiction, where it applies, how it applies, when it applies. And then finally, I would just like to say that I think it's time to modernize Act 250. It's Vermont's landmark environmental and development law. And I think with these changes, we can say that even more proudly, that it serves Vermont now and in our future.
Just for clarity, when you're referring to plans or reports, can you name those so that people will know what to take a look at in order to keep up with all the good work that's been going on?
Sure.
And make sure they're on our websites under the appropriate subject matter.
The first is the Regional Planning Commission's Future Land Use Report. The second is Designations 2050, I think it's called. And then the third is necessary updates to Act 250.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much.
We are moving right along. A rare experience for a committee to be ahead of time.
Maybe it's this
Thank you.
building. Maybe we're more disciplined in a different space.
The other thing is for any witnesses who are speaking today, if you have written testimony that you can share with us, if you could send that to us, it'll help us create a better webpage for people who want to follow up or for community members who want to look at what you brought forward. If you email them to the two committee assistants for our committees, Ms. Newman and Ms. Aleman, then that would be helpful. Okay, so with that, we're up to Mr. Seelig, Gus Seelig, Executive Director, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. Thank you for coming in. Always good to see you.
Good morning. So for the record, Gus Seelig, Director for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. The Housing and Conservation Board stands at the cross-section of this question that Senator Ram Hinsdale talked about of land use, of both conserving the things we treasure the most and trying to build in the places that it makes the most sense. And that's a piece of why we were invented back in the 1980s when the pace of development had, after that early recession, really picked up. And you're both committees of jurisdiction that oversee our work. So I want to walk through this saying I am not an Act 250 expert. I'm a funder of projects, and I have observed lots of projects with lots of difficulty over the years and really want to applaud the work you did on Act 47. When you sit at the local level on a development review board, making your neighbors mad at you is really hard. And my own observation is human beings are not good at change, whether it's a change in their view or change in the amount of traffic they have or any of those kinds of things. So Act 47 has already netted results in the permitting of emergency shelters. This town of Waterbury did a reversal when they understood, I think, Act 47 and permitted a building in its downtown. So you're having a positive impact, and I appreciate that work. There are two former mayors of Montpelier on this committee, and we have seen the great difficulty of achieving community consensus around Sabin's pasture for all the time I've been in my job. And so it's really hard. The old expression of all politics is local. And when you are in a neighborhood where there are people with lots of money and lots of attorneys and time on their hands, we saw in Woodstock a case take a decade to work through the court system, 2.5 times to the Supreme Court. So your focus here is really important. I apologize for anything I might repeat that you heard either at the session I did with Maura Collins and Sue Minter at the beginning in December, or I've already been in front of the Economic Development Committee. A few things that go not to Act 250, but to the general subject that you're working on. And this goes back to what Governor Dean said in his farewell address. If we don't build up, we will sprawl out. So as you do this work, anything you can do to encourage communities to allow taller buildings is a good thing. Recently in Windsor, Vermont, the community and the historic preservationists in that community, they permitted a building only because the developers agreed to cut one story off. There's a historic church on the National Register down the street on the other side of the street and thought that would have a negative impact. In Bristol, we just did a great project on Firehouse Lane. But I would say to you, Senator Bray, it would have been great to reopen that situation and build 3-story buildings instead of 2. And we would have had 30 apartments instead of 20. So think about that as you do your work. Figure out how to shorten the appeals process, because whenever somebody goes to court, it takes at least 2 years if the appellants go all the way to Supreme Court. And in this environment, even if the cost increases go down from where they've been in double digits, or last year at 7% to 3%, the basis on which costs are based to build housing is now so much higher that 3% ends up being a lot of money. So time is money in trying to get housing built. And finally, the last two things I'll say is the corrective action plan process at DEC is taking people a year or more to work through. This is something the Governor's Council on Housing and Homelessness has said, can't we cut that time in half? But I hope you'll ask the administration what their plans are to speed that process up. And finally, can we use infrastructure dollars to support developers that are coming to us through the bipartisan act to take the cost of water and sewer off of them, which is a big cost driver. I want to acknowledge all the good that I think I've seen Act 250 do over the years. Paul Brune was a great personal friend. I love being able to see the whale's tails at Exit 4. And we helped conserve some of the land around that as part of the ultimate settlement. I'm glad that downtown Rutland has Walmart in the downtown. So there's a lot of good that people have been able to do because we have Act 50. We need to acknowledge that. You'll hear from Kathy Beyer in a few minutes. She's a practitioner with far more on the ground expertise than I have. But I want to note that one of the things that Act 250 never was able to achieve, and I was not around for the beginning of it, but it didn't get, the legislature failed to pass a statewide land use plan. I was around for the Act 200 debate, and the idea was bottom-up planning. And I think we were invented in part to help protect the rural landscape because people decided 9B was not enough. And we've now conserved, our friends in some nonprofit organizations, about 200,000 acres of our ag base permanently. But we decided 9B was not enough. In the same way, you invented the downtown program, downtown tax credits, and now designation programs. What I want to suggest to all of you is that I think that that's a different way at the question of having a statewide land use plan. I'm not sure Vermonters will ever accept a top-down land use plan, but I think a bottom-up plan where communities designate the areas they want to grow is the right approach to take. And so we've done a lot of work in St. Albans with a very entrepreneurial manager and city council, and they've made a decision about where they want growth to occur. And we've funded now 4 projects that will produce well over 100 units of housing in that designated area. So I think that's a great model in the reality that we're not going to have a statewide land use plan. I do want to note that I think you have to consider how democracy works and when we have enough democracy. So when a community gets a designation, that's through a public process at the local level. It's approved by a regional planning commission and approved at the state level. And so at some point, I think we all have to ask the question, when do you then have the right to build, or is everything negotiable forever between a developer and a governing body? And I think that that's a place to focus your work and to look at the reports that you're getting from the regional planners and from the Natural Resources Board of that. All of that mimics what Art Gibb, who's one of the supporters and sponsors of our legislation, had hoped for right at the beginning when Act 250 was created. I do want to note that we have had great success with the realities of priority housing projects, and we're doing great work in communities. And just heard from Mr. Davidson where South Burlington and Burlington adopted inclusionary zoning. And that is provided not just for market rate housing, but for affordable housing to be required as part of the package. So I'd ask you to think about, as we change the system, how do you insist that communities reserve capacity, reserve land, so that some of the land, some of that will turn into affordable housing, because market rate housing at its current price is not going to serve teachers, cops, firefighters, nurses, aides, librarians, lots of
Legislators.
legislators, yes, the whole gamut. None of the work will ultimately work in terms of the market will produce market rate housing, but without funding that brings the cost down, we're not going to have what we really need for the working Vermonters who the governor talked about. Kathy will talk more about the Act 250 process, but a couple of observations for me, which is developers don't begin that process till they have all the rest of their permits. And so it's not that the Natural Resources Board is unwilling to move things along, but it is that a developer wouldn't initiate the cost or time if they're not going to get their permits from A&R and they're not going to get their permits from the community. It just adds cost, adds risk. So that's a piece of the problem that I think you'll hear about in terms of Act 250. We have seen some circumstances where people built below the threshold in order to not trigger Act 250. So again, going back to the idea that we want to designate areas, plan for areas that ought to have growth. I think that then allowing that growth and that density to happen so that we do protect the environment by not sprawling out is important. Act 250 was created, as other folks said, at a different time. And as somebody who graduated from college in 1976, my pals and I rented a beautiful farmhouse in North Calais for $150 a month. It was not a well-insulated house. We lived about 8 feet from the Ashley wood stove that winter. Got laid off in the middle of the winter, but we made things work. A few years later, my wife and I bought a house in East Calais for $26,500. Interest rates were close to 10%, but that house at its last sale at the beginning of the pandemic went for $300,000. The woman and her boyfriend who came to buy that house, they split up and then she went off for another job. Her dad loves the house. So this beautiful village house is now used about 8 times a year. We have a shortage of housing in Vermont. That's one of the things that's different. The cost basis is so different today than it was in the time that Act 250 was invented. So we do have a real shortage that we have to address. And so those are some of the differences between today and 50 years ago in terms of the environment that we're trying to navigate. I think communities also are doing more planning work because we've provided, whether it was Act 200 or designation programs, more resources for planning and more capability. So I hope this is an issue and a year where we can find common ground and we can figure out the right balance where we are using a thoughtful planning process, supporting communities, but also asking everybody to make room to be more equitable and more welcoming as a state. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope I'm under 10 minutes.
11:49. Yeah, I do just a quick clarification. You referred to a corrective action plans. Can you just say a little more about what those are?
When you have a site that has environmental problems, you then need a corrective action plan. And it takes a really long time, and Kathy can probably speak to this way better than I, but I am hearing regularly from developers who don't want to build on polluted sites where there's any danger, how long that process takes. And I don't know I'm not an environmental expert either. I'm not a scientist here, but I'm just saying that it takes more than a year to work through that process too often. And so I think that's something that we really need to look at with our friends at the Department of Environmental Conservation.
Very much. With that, next up is Seth Jensen, Principal Planner of Lamoille County Planning Commission. And Mr. Jensen, are you on the?
I'm
Oh,
behind
there
you.
you are. Thank you. Sorry. Looking at the screen. Good morning. Thanks for coming in.
It's not perfect. It's true. Jan.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'm Seth Jensen. I'm the Deputy Director of the Lamoille County Planning Commission. LCPC's Executive Director, Tasha Wallace, spoke to the Committee on Natural Resources last week about S213, a bill that's focused on protection of wetlands, floodplains, and dam removal. I'm also joined today by Melissa Manka, who's a new planner at LCPC, who has been working since joining us in November on housing issues through the Housing Navigator program, as well as the Municipal Technical Assistance Program, two of the very important initiatives that the legislature passed last session. So I would like to take a moment to speak about some of the housing issues that we face in Lamoille County. And it is impossible to discuss housing in Lamoille County, planning in Lamoille County, and land use in Lamoille County without discussing last summer and winter's flooding. And I would just like to be sure that we are all clear on the severity and urgency that we currently face in our region and the state as a whole. Two of the four largest floods recorded in Lamoille County occurred in the last 6 months. That's the July flood and then the December flood. And those floods highlighted gaps and inadequacies of many of our existing programs and systems, and is often the case. Those gaps have the greatest impact on the people with the fewest resources. Those gaps exist in many areas. Those gaps also exist in the planning process and the permitting process. And what we are watching unfold in our time is the climate crisis and the housing crisis converging into an equity crisis. So nearly 6 months after the July floodwaters receded, many people and communities are still living daily with the impacts of the floods. We met just last week with the folks who are organizing the Lamoille Area Recovery Network. And there are still people who have been displaced from their homes, are experiencing or at risk of homelessness, people even in this weather who are living in homes that are damaged without heat or electricity, and people who are living in unsafe conditions and unable to relocate because of the lack of safe and affordable housing options outside of the floodplain. So I could walk through the impacts in each of the communities in our region in recognition of the time limits and respect to other witnesses. I will save that for my written testimony, but I will forward that on to all of you. I'll summarize those issues by noting that two major issues were highlighted by the flooding, more than two, but two that are pertinent to the discussion today. And that is that many of the areas that were most impacted by the flood are also home to low and moderate income households, the location of our oldest, but also most affordable housing stock, and the location where there are high concentrations of rental housing. A few days after the July flood, I spoke to a member of a local select board who had himself fled his home in the middle of the night on July 10th as the waters were cresting in the Lamoille. And he remarked to me that if there was any silver lining, it was that the flood occurred in July and not December. On December 14th, that comment developed a sense of cruel irony. As the Lamoille River flooded once again, and in his community, we were less than 3 inches away from the river once again cresting into many of the neighborhoods that had been evacuated only 6 months before. We saw the post office in Johnson flood that was not near as severe. And though the physical impacts were not as severe as July, it had left great impact of lasting trauma on people who had experienced the flood in July. and what we heard from our partners in the human service world is that people who had been trying to make do since July came out of the woodwork seeking help. So I'm going to read a letter that's now 10 years old that was sent to me from the residents of the Manns Meadow Senior Housing Complex in Jeffersonville, which had flooded in 2011, which was the focus of a lot of flood mitigation planning efforts to reduce damages, because I think it is as policymakers, whether the local or regional or state level, important to remember that housing isn't just about a structure, it's about security, it's about people living in those. In 2011, this building was evacuated, and these are their words, not mine. And I just want to, as someone with the access and privilege to speak to you, make sure that their voices are heard as well. For us, memories of the forced evacuations from our homes remain frightful ones. With the increased frequency and severity of the storms that led to major flooding events, these anxieties are compounded. It is stressful to our families and loved ones as well, who had been under the impression that we were living in secure circumstances. And I want to pause and return to the policy discussion on that last statement, who had been under the impression that we were living in secure circumstances, that one of the things we have learned that we knew, but perhaps need to learn again, is how old and inadequate the FEMA maps are for predicting actual flood levels. From a policy standpoint, while we've widely acknowledged that those FEMA maps are old and outdated, we also need to acknowledge that our process for identifying where new development can and should happen is also old and outdated and inadequate to deal with the challenges that we are facing today. The designation program, which has been a wonderful program for revitalizing the cores of our villages and downtowns, was focused on the cores of the villages and downtowns, not the surrounding residential areas. There is no clear provision in existing statute for identifying new areas that are disassociated with existing villages and downtowns that are located in safer areas out of floodplain areas. There is some language about that in the designation study, as well as the Regional Planning Commission's land use study. And those are gaps that are as equally important to address as the outdated flood maps. We need to both be identifying where it's unsafe to build, as well as where we can be building. I was a young planner after Irene. I have my recovery sticker from working on Irene recovery. And I remember the celebration every time we reopened a road, every time a new community was open. And I want to close, I think, with the thought that for the recovery of the July 2023 and December 2023 floods to be truly successful, we need to have the same celebration for building homes outside of the floodplain that the average Vermonter can afford. And that will be the true mark of recovery from these events. That will be the true mark of moving forward. We need to figure out where that housing is going to be built. We need to enable it, and then we need to build it. And we need to start in 1995. We can't start in 1995, so we need to start in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you.
Scott, you're still a young planner.
I will say younger planner there.
Two quick things. So one, S213
Yes.
is focused exactly on the mapping and river corridor and floodplain,
Thank you.
addressing that from an environmental and a housing point of view, development point of view. And highlighting that. The other thing is thanks for reminding us, or reminding me and others, of the trauma that lives, we're having a very tidy meeting in a tidy building, talking pieces of paper, figuring out plans. It's all important and necessary, but underneath it, there are a lot of people who are really suffering still. And I thank you for reminding us of that, bringing their voice to the meeting.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for recognizing them as well.
I think Seth said something when he testified to us about being up at night and considering it a personal failure if we don't see the housing built. And I know it's because you carry those stories with you of everyone you have to tell that you don't have another option for them. So we'll be doing this in your honor as well.
Thank you.
So you've been part of the change.
Thank you. Thank you for everything you are doing.
With that, then next up is Kathy Byer, Senior VP of Real Estate Development for Evernorth. And Ms. Byer, you're on this.
I'm here.
She's here. I just
I keep getting thrown to a curveball. I look up and I see someone's name on the screen, so I think they're gonna.
She may be sharing her
I'm
screen.
gonna try to share my screen. Are we able to do that this morning?
Yep, Macaulay is.
Believe so.
Give it a try. It always makes me nervous. I'm gonna get it wrong. So,
See a ball game.
see what happens. Did it work?
There you go.
Amazing. Good morning. Had some great testimony this morning. And as you know, I am testifying as a nonprofit housing developer from Evernorth, but also as a member of the NRB steering committee. And one of the clear legislative charges you gave the steering committee was to come up with a place-based jurisdiction framework for Act 250. And you've heard a lot about that this morning, the great comments from Charlie and Catherine and others. I'd like to stray a bit from the NRB report and provide some context, specifically as it relates to affordable housing. So the Downtown Designation Program started in 1999. And over the years, the legislature added other designations programs such as the Village Center, growth centers, new town centers, and neighborhood development areas. And I think it was about 10 years ago that the concept of priority housing projects was introduced. And as you know, those are mixed income developments with 20% of the units dedicated to affordable. And if you are I'm going to start saying PHP because it's a lot easier to say than priority housing projects. PHPs are exempt from Act 250 if you're in a designated downtown, a new town center or growth center, or a neighborhood development area. And there used to be a cap on the number of units. You lifted that cap last year until 2026. And I will say that the PHP exemption has been utilized frequently by both nonprofit and private developers. And in the majority of Evernorth's projects with our local workers around the state have benefited from the PHP exemption. So in my mind, the PHP exemption has laid the groundwork for what is included in the NRB steering committee recommendation. And I will say, I think it is monumental that there was consensus that there should be Act 250 exemption in what is called the Tier 1 designation areas. I think the definition of Tier 1 areas is likely among the most challenging efforts you will have before you as you consider this. But I wanted to talk about some existing framework that's in place, which is the neighborhood development areas. And I think you will find a very good foundation for how you might frame a Tier 1 area. The NDA, Neighborhood Development Area, is a very robust application process. I'm such a nerd, I have the application right here. And the application process includes assessment of flood hazard areas, mapping of important natural resources, public infrastructure, and density requirements. So here's, I can send you the whole application if you want, but you have to identify many of the things that are of concern in the 10 criteria for Act 250 in the NDA. And in my mind, that is what we are talking about when we talk about exempting development in tier 1 areas. You might ask, why is this important for the purposes of building more housing? And Gus touched upon it. And I will tell you that as a real estate developer, that I think the Act 250 permitting process is administered in a very professional manner. But we would get our Act 250 permits sooner, but all the underlying state permits have to be in hand. State water, wastewater, stormwater, water supply, which is a very lengthy process to get through. So that means the Act 250 permit can't drop and the 30-day appeal period clock can't start. And for a real estate developer, this is the time when you are the most at risk. You have not vested in your permit, and really the value that you are pursuing by spending money on architects and engineers is at risk until you have that permit appeal free. And it's not uncommon. I'm shocked sometimes when we get to the for our projects that need Act 250 permits, and I look at how much we've spent in pre-development, it can be up to $500,000 that has been at risk until we get past that appeal-free period. So in my mind, the true cost of when we say permit redundancy is this risk that the developer has to take to get to that appeal-free moment. And if we can construct a tier 1 designation that provides a framework that is in keeping with the framework of Act 250, I do think we are going to be able to build more housing, and we're going to be able to build it a bit faster. I want to point out that the NRB steering committee in the report made it clear that the recommendations are as a whole, the consensus only held together as a whole, which meant that also there needed to be the tier 2 and tier 3 designation areas. But I want to shift to another topic that is governance and appeals. The steering committee did have consensus on creating a more professionalized NRB Natural Resources Board with a full-time chair and 3 to 5 part-time members who had experience in land use. But there was not consensus on whether the appeals should continue to be heard in the environmental court or go to the professionalized NRB. I will say, regardless of what you decide, a strong message needs to be that appeals of housing projects need to be decided within 6 months. And currently it takes 12 to 24 months. And when I'm talking about appeals, I'm also talking about appeal of the local permit. I think you are hearing from or heard from Ben Frost from New Hampshire about the New Hampshire Housing Board of Appeals, which does require resolution within 6 months. In my understanding, they are actually averaging 4 months. I think most of you have heard about our Putney project on Holloway Drive. We are now almost in year 2 of fighting a permit battle. First, our appeal of our local permit, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. And now we've been appealed on a jurisdictional opinion. A jurisdictional opinion is just you go to the district coordinator, you present the evidence that you meet the priority housing project exemption, and the district coordinator signs as yes, agree. And as a developer, you have to have that to bring forward to your financing, because you need an attorney to sign a permit opinion. An attorney won't sign a permit opinion without that JO in hand. We were appealed by the same neighbor on the JO. Elevation of 25 homes we're trying to build on Holloway Drive. It's right across from the Putney Food Co-op. It is in a neighborhood development area. If we had a reasonable approach to resolving appeals in Vermont, we would be moving 25 households into their homes now. And I want to stress, these aren't units, they're homes. And these are the voices we don't hear. The voices of renters who want to live on Holloway Drive in Putney. They're not even given a seat at the table. We don't hear from them. Maybe they don't live in Putney now, but they'd like to live there. Maybe they're unhoused. I don't know. I can't meet them until we open the doors to their 25 new homes. Thank you.
For another clarification, so you're through permitting and then your JO was appealed. Can you just explain briefly? So the JO, my understanding is it's what indicates that you need to be in Act 250 or you're exempted from. And so what was the issue that got appealed?
The jurisdictional opinion that the district coordinator issues is what confirms that you are a PHP and therefore exempt from Act 250. And anyone who has party status in Act 250 can appeal. And the appeal, frankly, had very little explanation of why.
The specifications for a prior housing project, at least as I've seen them so far, seem relatively cut and dried. Can you just say very briefly what it is that's appealable about whether or not a development is actually correctly characterized as a PHP?
It's a good question. If you have an expert here that might be better off.
Diana can
I
probably
can
answer
speak
that.
to the Putney project. Sabina Haskell with the NRB. There is a road that goes through the property. There's two parcels, but they're the same span number, by the way. So same owner, but there's a road that goes through there. So my understanding is they feel like it doesn't qualify because they've been split. And RJO found that it was indeed a PHP.
Yeah.
But that's a nuance that is being challenged.
Well, I've
And it's
I have a good
road to
sense of when-
parking. It's a road to parking for the units.
well, thank you for that, and I know enough not to ask anything more. Because it will lead to an appropriate but much longer conversation. So thanks for helping fill us in. Thanks so much for coming in. And with that, we'll move to Joanna Lawton from Rebuild by Design. Ms. Lawton, good morning. Thank you for joining our joint committees.
Thank you and good morning. I am going to try to share my screen if that's possible.
Should be getting that permission momentarily.
And if we're sharing it in Mahali's, is there a way to get it bigger? Because Kathy's was great, but none of us could possibly read it. So there was only, I'm hoping Kathy's sending it to you because that's the only way we'll ever read it. Okay. Except maybe young eyes.
Oh, there we go. Great, thank you. Let's see if we can make it as big as possible.
That would be great.
All right. Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. My name is Johanna Law, and I'm a project manager at Rebuild by Design. We are a nonprofit organization that works with communities and governments to plan for climate change. And planning for climate change is very much embedded in our DNA, as our origin story is rooted in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy hitting the Northeast. It revealed to our region that not only were we much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change on a physical level, but also that our social vulnerabilities were inextricably linked to the physical vulnerabilities. And so solving for one had to address solving for the other. In response to this massive challenge, the federal government, under the Department of Housing and Urban Development and President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Recovery Task Force, realized that a traditional design approach to rebuilding a region and putting back exactly what was there before would not address the scale of the challenge. As a result, they launched the Rebuild by Design Hurricane Sandy Design Competition, which was an interdisciplinary year-long design competition that changed the traditional approach to design after a disaster. By creating an iterative process of research and design that truly raised the bar for community collaboration and centering communities at the heart of all of the outcomes. At the end of this competition, 7 projects were awarded for a total of $930 million. And those 7 winning designs that are in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut now have over $4.3 billion over $4.3 billion invested in them, which really demonstrates that when you have innovative climate adaptation infrastructure projects, they will attract a lot more dollars. And so since then, we have been bringing our approach, our research, our designs to communities around the world. And more recently, we have been focusing our attention a little bit closer to home. We've been looking closer at the US and even at communities that historically have been sort of tagged as climate havens. We know that the realities on the ground are not exactly what we're hearing in the news. So this past summer, just shortly after the July flooding, we put out a report that looked at the recent flooding as well as the litany of events that this event had built upon. Our report, called the Vermont Atlas of Disaster, found that Vermont had experienced 17 federally declared major disasters just between 2011 and 2021. And 15 of those events were due to tropical storms and flooding. This placed Vermont 7th overall in the entire nation for highest number of disaster declarations in that time period, and ranked it 5th in the country for per capita post-disaster federal assistance allocations. We also found in our report that every county had had 4 or more recent major disasters, and 6 counties had had at least 10, with Washington County having had the highest number of disaster declarations in the state with over 11 disasters. And I do just want to note, because this cuts off at 2021, some of the more recent droughts, severe storms, and flooding were not even captured in this data that we know is a growing data set of recent events. So just to give you a really quick overview of what is in the report that I think can be useful to you as decision makers, but will also be accessible through the written testimony. This report includes maps that show the occurrences of disaster declarations for every single county in Vermont, for a total, as I mentioned, of 17. And it has it right next to the post-disaster allocations of federal funding through FEMA, which is mapped in the orange map. And we've added that to HUD, CDBG, DR funds to give sort of a glimpse into the amount of federal post-disaster funding that's going into recovering from these events. But I always like to caveat that we know this is just a piece of the pie of the true cost of these events, as there's also insurance payouts, there's loan programs, there's the personal cost that people and residents are taking on. But it does start to give us a sense of the magnitude and the scale of this challenge ahead. We've included all of the data in our report, so you can go in, and if you look at the tables in the report, you can see actually county by county the number of disaster declarations that county has experienced in this timeframe, as well as the total FEMA obligations for public assistance dollars and hazard mitigation dollars. And so you can go to a county and look at the disasters it has experienced and the federal funding it has received. You can also go to a disaster event and then look at the specific counties going down that were impacted by it. This report also includes a map of the social vulnerability throughout the state using CDC data, as well as energy reliability by utility territory. So the areas that are a little bit darker orange in that map are areas that on average take longer to come back online during an energy outage event. And finally, the last set of maps that we've recently added to this report is the disaster declaration map with an overlay of legislative districts. So you can look at the specific legislative districts and see which counties they represent and the total number of disasters that district also has experienced. And so I do want to note that this report for Vermont builds out of a nationwide report that we've put out last year that includes a number of different chapters that are useful to decision makers, but 2 that I really want to highlight are the guide for states to build a collaborative program and new finance tools for addressing this challenge. And the reason that we thought it was, so incredibly important when we began digging into this data to put out this step forward and sort of the the 1-2-step guide of how to solve for this challenge is we found when we looked at the entire US that 90% of counties in the US have had a federal disaster declaration due to extreme weather just between 2011 and 2021. And all of this data for us immediately, aside from making our jaws drop on the floor, show that the reality is that climate change is no longer just coming, climate change is here. And for Vermont specifically, this means that Vermont needs a sustainable source of long-term climate adaptation infrastructure funding. We've proposed in our report one way in which Vermont could support this challenge or address this challenge is through a 2% surcharge on property and casualty insurance, which could raise $600 million. We like this mechanism for supporting resilient infrastructure because it's progressive. You can surcharge property wealth protection. And so intrinsically, those with more homes and cars, boats, etc., are likely to have more insurance. It also would go directly back to making those insured assets more resilient and could decrease certain insurance premiums for all consumers. So if you look at specific models such as FEMA's Community Rating Program, which rewards consumers who all invest in lowering their flood risk, they actually decrease the premiums by 5 to 45%. So already there's a benefit built into building resilient infrastructure. The investment can also seed a new industry and support thousands of jobs. We also believe that you can take it a step further to institutionalize equity into the program by ensuring that the surcharge is instituted on certain types of insurance that largely are connected to climate impacts. So for example, we suggest exempting workers' compensation, medical malpractice lines from property and casualty insurance so that you are looking at specifically lines of insurance that cover types of property that are also contributing to the climate crisis. You could also take another step further and exempt certain residents such as lowest income policyholders and affordable housing residents. We know that currently there are bills being considered that look into an insurance surcharge mechanism, and we do have just 2 recommendations that we think could make this sort of policy become a lot stronger. One would be to ensure that you use a percentage instead of a set amount of a surcharge so that it is a sustainable source of funding that could grow over time as the need grows. Also, we think that there are certain ways that you can define the types of projects that the fund would support upfront to ensure you are addressing the exact needs of Vermonters. So just to point out one specific example, in New York State, we built the research and advocacy to support a resilient infrastructure fund that was voted through an environmental bond act. And we made sure that $250 million was allocated specifically for managed retreat so that those homeowners who live in areas that we will not be able to adapt had options and would end up having a program they can turn to relocate out of harm's way. We also know that some advocates are advocating for a polluter's pay mechanism, which could raise up to $2.5 billion in the state, and also has a direct policy tie to those who have made the mess in the state. And finally, I do just want to conclude that, we are rather agnostic to the particular source of funding that Vermont utilizes, though I will say that we have seen time and again, every community, city, state that has started to invest in their resilient infrastructure has been overwhelmingly supported by voters. In New York State in particular, we saw in our recent election where we advocated for an environmental bond act that the bond act actually surpassed or flew by with what's the expression? I'm blanking on it, flying colors with a greater support than even our governor had at the time. And so I'll just end there that if you have any questions, happy to follow up after. And we really hope that we can work with you to support a resilient infrastructure fund for Vermont so that we can protect the lives, the property, and the communities all across the state.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm guessing we have your PowerPoint.
Yes, you should have the PowerPoint, and we'll have an additional written out testimony as well.
And one very quick question is, who are your partners in Vermont? Are you working, for instance, with anyone in state government or legislators? How are you connecting to us?
Yeah, we've been building out a pretty deep network at this moment in Vermont when we were building out the report. And I apologize if I confuse the alphabet soup of acronyms of nonprofit organizations. We were working with a coalition, Vermont Businesses and Sustainability, VBSR, Vermont Energy Action Network. We were working with Vermont Public Interest Research Group, and I may be blanking on a few. So we've been working with a coalition of primarily nonprofit organizations who have been working in the environmental sector, and then more recently building out some ties throughout policy leaders in the state. And we are always open to finding more partnerships. That is really our goal, is to be a resource to you all.
Sure. Any particular contact with the Agency of Natural Resources?
I'll have to double check with my colleague and I can get back to you.
Thank you so much.
If we wanted to get a copy of the report.
I have it. We've printed them out. Magali has printed out. We can print out.
I'd love one.
So sounds like I think all our presentations are going to end up on both committees' web pages probably today.
Great.
It's on ours already.
Cool.
We were really glad to invite Rebuild by Design because I think we saw some raised eyebrows from your committee, and it really gave us a lot to think about in a very short amount of time. And we recommend people have them back in to testify. One of the interesting things about your tax proposals, you have 6 of the 7 members of Senate Finance around this table, including the chair. And I think Chair Cummings was taking on board this recommendation and had some questions as a follow-up or concerns.
Finance also regulates insurance. Has any state adopted the surcharge on insurance policies?
No, we've gotten really close in New York State, and then ultimately our governor at the time decided to go with the Bond Act because it was a little bit more politically feasible at the time. Though we do think that there's still an opportunity in New York State, and then there are a couple of other states that are considering at the time: New Jersey, Massachusetts, and a little bit of Maine as well.
Well, thank you again for your presentation. And with that, we'll go on to Rob Wilmington, attorney from North Bennington. Good morning, Mr. Wilmington. Thanks for joining us. I know you had you're jumping from one meeting to another, so thanks for fitting us in.
I am, thank you. So my name is Rob Wilmington. I live in North Bennington. I've practiced municipal land use and environmental law in Vermont for 40 years. I recently retired. I've been involved in probably 20 administrative and court proceedings involving Act 250, including a number of appeals to the Supreme Court. I've represented towns, regional planning commissions, interveners, and project proponents. I tried appeals before the old environmental board as well as the environmental court. My most recent case in the Supreme Court resulted in the reversal of an egregiously bad decision by the environmental court relating to the siting of a commercial development at an interstate exit. And I've litigated dozens of zoning cases before local boards in court and before the Supreme Court. In connection with housing, I've served for 7 years. I served for 7 years as the first chair of the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. As a municipal lawyer, I've been involved in the planning and financing of a range of housing projects in Bennington County. And I'm also a member of a small community development company in North Bennington that's been trying to redevelop a large house into multifamily housing in the center of our village. And even with the so-called missing middle state funding, the project has proved to be too expensive to go forward. There are no obvious regulatory issues there. It's just the construction costs and the soft costs are too high. So from that perspective, I'd like to briefly make 3 points. First, in my experience, Act 250 has not been a significant barrier to the type of housing projects that have been proposed and built in Bennington County. Local zoning and permitting processes more often create uncertainty than Act 250. And the issues that arise in Act 250 proceedings are often different from those considered in local zoning proceedings. I'm sure there are examples of duplicated review of the same issues in zoning and Act 250 cases, but in 40 years practicing in this field, I saw very little of that. Second, the appeals process in the environmental court has not worked well. The old environmental board, in my experience, did a much better job in processing appeals in the court. The board's decisions provided much more guidance for the party, and frankly, the process was more streamlined. I would strongly recommend that the environmental court be stripped of jurisdiction over Act 250's appeals. I think all the stakeholders, including developers, would be better served. I also want to emphasize that I've seen many cases in which project opponents had valid, even compelling reasons to oppose development projects, and that's particularly with commercial and industrial ones. There needs to be an appropriate venue for those issues to be resolved, but the jurisdiction in the environmental court has been a flop. It's time to restore a competent administrative body to do this important work, perhaps with panels or with the aid of hearing officers, as with the Public Utility Commission. And third and finally, I think expediting permit review in designated areas is the right approach to getting new housing built with appropriate regulatory review. Developers need more certainty and predictable costs. Communities need assurance that they will not be unduly burdened by environmental impacts or infrastructure costs associated with new projects. And the most important step to accomplish this is to designate particular development areas that meet prescribed standards. I'm not prepared to comment on the specific recommendations of the recently completed NRB study, but I've looked at the report and I believe the approach of 3-tiered locational jurisdictions suggested there, it seems spot on to me and the right way to proceed. So thank you for inviting me to testify. I'd be happy to address any questions.
Thank you very much. Looking at are there, that you're so succinct that we could take a question or two. Any members of the committees want to ask a question of Mr. Woolman?
Senator Harrison.
Just, and this question doesn't need to be answered now, but commercial and industrial has come up a couple of times in this meeting. And I think it would be helpful to know at some point in this process, of course, we're talking about housing, that's our main focus, but we don't want to inadvertently impact commercial and development or commercial and industrial in ways that we don't intend. And there might be opportunities to make that process better. So I'm just saying that I appreciate you bringing that up, the commercial and industrial. And if you want to provide written comments, that would be wonderful.
And I do think the NRB study took into account commercial and industrial activity.
Yeah, just tier. Big tier ones.
Yes, I mean, discussing, right, the tier 1 now says would be okay.
Right, right. But I have some questions about that too.
Sure,
But
sure.
we can talk about that in our.
Senator Brock.
That's a question. In your opinion, you mentioned that the environmental court model does not seem to work well. Why would a housing board or some other enterprise, such as the use of the hearing officer model, work better than the court model?
Well, I'll give you two responses to that. One is I've experienced both of them in Vermont, and my experience was that the old environmental board did a better job. It got decisions that were they had proceedings that were workable, that were consistent, and I practiced 10 or 15 years before that, and as well as the environmental court, and I just found it was better for everybody, frankly. Second of all, you know, when the old environmental board and the NRB have to do policy and regulatory work, they have you have a deeper knowledge of what the whole set of issues is, I think, than the court brought to it. And it informed the boards, when it informed the old environmental board, when it was trying to do regulatory policy making, it had a really good grip on what the real practical issues were. Other lawyers may remind me here, but I don't recall many environmental court decisions that really sort of gave broad frameworks that were helpful to future litigants. And the environmental board was able to formulate approaches in a pretty coherent way. So I'm speaking from experience. I think the Public Utilities Commission, which also does regulatory policy making as well as adjudicatory stuff, has worked pretty well. And some version of that I just think is better than the court. So I'm not sure that fully addresses your question, but it's a practical my practical experience, and also I think the role of combining them makes for better policy and also better adjudication.
Great. Thanks so much, Mr. Wilmington, for joining us and providing testimony. And we have been churning along at a good clip this morning. I'd like to propose we'll take a 10-minute break, so we will reconvene